Hi, I'm Adam and welcome to First Man Photography. Today I'm in Whitby. We're going to be talking about how to use long exposure photography to up your photography game. Let's go. Before we get into this today, this video is sponsored by Squarespace. If you need a domain name, a website, or an online store, then make your next move with Squarespace. So since I was in Glencoe in January, I have not been out to shoot any landscape photography, and that's because Glencoe was just so epic, and I was really happy with the shots I captured. And like I've mentioned before, when I am doing landscape photography particularly, I ride a wave. There are ups, there are downs, and when I hit a high like Glencoe, there's always a slump afterwards where my creativity just eludes me for a little bit and it takes some time to get things back and going again. One of the things is to employ different techniques, and that is what I do with long exposure photography. So I'm going to talk you through some of the things to do to start shooting some really nice long exposure images, and just gives you another technique to be more creative and create something different to everything else you see. There are a few things you're going to need though in order to do that, and we'll talk about that in a minute, but isn't it just absolutely brilliant being at the beach? The feeling I always used to get when I was younger as you drive down to the coast, that first sight you get of the sea is just so exciting. My kids get excited about it now, and I still feel excited in the very same way. You then get out of the car in a place like Whitby, you can smell the sea air, the fish and chips, and it's just really quite a special thing at the seaside. So the things you need are firstly a scene to shoot, and I've come here to just by Whitby Abbey and I've got this view down to the harbour, and the bell's going off. I wonder what time it is. So I have Whitby Harbour here, and it's perfect for a long exposure because you need to have two elements. You need to have something that's moving and then something that's static in your image, because it's lengthening the exposure and smoothing out that movement that creates the interest in a long exposure shot and makes it different from a normal static shot. So after that, it's about gear really, and you're going to need a camera that has a bulb mode or a timer in order to push your exposure longer than 30 seconds. You're then going to need a filter, an ND filter, a solid ND filter of either 6, 10 or even 16 stops, which I'm using for this shot here. You're also going to need a tripod because any movement in your camera will lose sharpness out of your image, so a nice sturdy tripod is a recommendation. And then also you need to, if you're using a DSLR, you need to cover the eyepiece because light can creep in through the eyepiece, and during a 3 minutes plus exposure, that can really damage your image and make very strange things happen. So once we've done that, we need to compose our shot, and that's what I've done here. I've got the harbour sort of leading you up into those small lighthouses at the end of the harbour, and it's going to be a really straightforward image. I've got the sea or the horizon going along the top of the rule of thirds line, and that's going to be my shot. And as I smooth out the water and smooth out the clouds, it'll be quite an interesting image. So then it's about firstly taking a normal exposure, so we can then adjust our exposure time depending on what that is. So for this scene, it's 1/320th of a second at f8 and ISO 100. That's for my normal exposure. And then I need to use an app or a exposure calculator to work out how long that exposure is going to be. So in this case, it is 3 minutes 20 seconds. I use PhotoPills app. There are loads out there that will work out your exposure time. Before you put your filter on though, you need to make sure you have your focus locked, because once you attach that dark filter to the front of the camera will not know what to do because it won't be able to see in a normal way. So you need to get your focus locked and then switch to manual focus, so we're not going to get any focusing issues. Also, you need to turn your IS off if you have image stabilization, because that can introduce some movement into the image as well, and we don't want that. It's quite windy at the moment, so with that kind of exposure, I am going to get a slight amount of movement which will reduce the sharpness a little bit, but it shouldn't be too bad. So once we've done that, we just need to punch in our exposure time. On this Canon 5D Mark IV, it lets you do it with a built-in bulb timer. If you don't have one of them, you're going to need to put in a shutter release cable and just turn it into bulb mode, and then lock off your exposure for as long as you have decided it needs to be, and then just time it with your phone, or some of the shutter release cables actually have a time on them. So I'm going to go ahead, I've got the bulb mode set, I've got the timer set, and I'm just going to use a 2-second timer so there's no movement in the camera, and then go ahead and shoot. Okay, so I'm set up for my second shot of the day, just as the sun is moving into golden hour. One of the really nice things about long exposure photography is it really says to the viewer that it's not just a snapshot. You have literally put the time and the effort in to capture something different than anyone else walking by would have captured. And this is quite a good example of what I've got set up here, and where you can really use long exposure to your advantage. So across the harbour there, towards the other harbour wall, there is this really interesting ladder, and the composition I have is just with that ladder in the scene, and then the harbour wall essentially filling the middle of the frame with the horizon on the top rule of thirds, and then on the bottom of the wall on the bottom rule of thirds. I have the 70 to 200mm lens on there, and I'm zoomed fairly well in at about 100mm on that ladder, and with the layers of the seaweed and the moss and the brick and the shape, it's all working perfectly for a long exposure because there's some really interesting textures in that wall and that ladder, and then that's contrasted against the really smoothed out water and then the smoothed out sky when I do the long exposure. So for this one, I only have a 10-stop filter for this lens, so it is going to be a 51-second exposure, and that's still enough to smooth out the water and smooth out the sky and create that effect that I'm looking for. The type of ND filter that you use really depends on your budget. This one, which I'm testing out today for the first time, is a very, very cheap one. This was about £20 and it fits on the front of the 70 to 200. I have used expensive ones, I've used cheap ones. This is actually looking to be pretty decent. It doesn't introduce a colour cast or anything like that, so I'm fairly impressed so far. And long exposure photography does not have to be expensive on top of what you've got. This is a 10-stop one, like I said, but yeah, pretty good. Another great thing about long exposure is that if you have people walking through your scene, and particularly in a busy sort of tourist area like this, you can remove them from the shot using the long exposure, because as long as they keep moving through your scene, they won't be captured at any one point, and it's a really good technique for removing people from your scene. So I'm all set up to take this shot. I have the bulb timer on again. I'm at f16. It's going to be a 51-second exposure at ISO 100, hoping that nice golden light stays on the wall. Shoot that, wait 51 seconds, and let's have a look. So I'm all set up for my last shot of the day, and I've had to have a bit of a mad dash down to the next town or village from Whitby down to Sand's End, because the tide, as you can see, has come right in and there was no beach left at Whitby. So I had to rush down. So I'm worried about the sea catching my feet here. I had to rush down to Sand's End because I wanted to finish the day with a seascape. With long exposure, when it comes to sunsets, which it is about now, long exposure is not the best thing to capture a sunset, especially if you've got the sun in the image, because you can imagine as the exposure goes, the sun is moving through your scene, so it just doesn't look right. What long exposure is absolutely perfect for, though, is that time after sunset, which we're just getting into now, and that's normally the time that the colour fills the sky if you've got a good sunset. And using long exposure to capture that is great, because what it does is, as that colour develops and as the colour moves at different spots through the sky, if you're exposing all the time that that's happening, the image will capture all of that colour. So actually you capture a little bit more colour than you would normally capture with just a very quick exposure image. And that's exactly what I'm doing here. So for my composition, I'm using these, I don't know what they're called, I do know the name, but I've forgotten. These poles leading into the sea, and then I've got the sea washing up just over this wall here, which I'm stood on. The tide is coming in, so I'm probably going to get wet feet very shortly. That's my composition from the bottom right-hand corner up into the image, and then just smoothing out that sea with a nice long exposure, and then capturing as much colour in the sky as I can. At the moment, I have a 6-stop filter on there, because as it gets to the end of the day and the light comes down, a 6-stop filter is good for just extending that exposure to around a minute to 2 minutes, depending on the light. So the good thing about the 6-stop filter is your camera can still see through it, so you can still compose through the live view. You can't really see through the viewfinder, but you can still compose through the live view when it compensates for that. Sunset wise tonight, are we going to get any colour? I don't really know, because at the other side of me there's the wall here for the road, but at the other side of that, where the sun is actually setting behind you, there was a massive bank of horizon cloud. So there's not going to be any massive colour, but I do have some very high altitude cloud here which could still catch some colour maybe 20 minutes after the sunset has happened. So I'm going to wait around for that and try and capture that in this long exposure. I might experiment with different things. You can experiment with different lengths of exposure to get different effects in the water. If you want some swirling, do it for a bit shorter, a few seconds even, and you can really experiment using your long exposures and use it creatively. And it's another technique just to get the creative juices flowing, and that's exactly what I use it for. Anyway, stick around to the end for the image and a really awesome time lapse to finish the day as well. But I really hope you've enjoyed the video. Leave a comment down below and let me know what you think of long exposure. Any questions as well, I'm quite happy to answer. And please do share the video, because that really helps me out. This video, as you know, is sponsored by Squarespace. Thanks so much to Squarespace for continuing to sponsor me. But if you go to squarespace.com to start your free trial today, and go to squarespace.com/firstman to get 10% off your first purchase. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed the video. I'll see you on another one very, very soon. I'm Adam. This is First Man Photography at the beach in the beautiful North Yorkshire. Out. Sharp, and it creates a nice juxtaposition